All right, so my first article is Effects of Teachers' Mathematical Knowledge for Teaching on Student Achievement. And this was written by Heather Hill, Brian Rowan, and Deborah Ball at the University of Michigan. And so the purpose of this research was to determine if there was a link between teachers' mathematical knowledge and student achievement. And so they had a pretty large sample size. They looked at first graders and they looked at third graders. And so there was probably about, 1,200 first graders that they studied and 1,700 third graders. And so what they did is they followed the first graders throughout a 2-year period, and the same they did with the third graders. And that was the student sample. Well, then there was a teacher sample as well, which was made up of 334 first grade teachers and 365 third grade teachers. And so they collected surveys on student achievement data from the students and the teachers across 115 elementary schools over a period of 2 years per grade level. So they conducted observations. They looked at specifically instructional components. They when they were picking these people, they intentionally picked a high poverty area. And they tried to make sure that there were an even number of boys as girls. And most of the children that they studied, it actually said 70% were non-white and non-Asian minorities. And so a vast number of their sample was minority children living in poverty. And so this was actually qualitative and quantitative because they used observations, they used test scores, they used questionnaires for both the teachers and the students to determine their findings. And so over the course of time, over the 2-year period, they ended up finding out that in both grade levels, both first and second, that students that had teachers with substantial mathematics knowledge actually performed better at the end of the year. And so they actually looked at some of the teacher backgrounds and the classroom characteristics and tried to pinpoint exactly what it was about those two things that actually helped students achieve at higher levels than their counterparts. And so what I found very interesting is that they found that the average first grader coming from teachers that had more math content courses while they were in high school, and when I say more, they were 2 to 6 classes specifically for mathematics, that those children actually gained 58 points on a test that they were given over the course of time, and that the third graders actually gained 39 points in comparison to their counterparts, which didn't gain as many. And so they found that over time, studying these children, that children that were in classes with teachers who they considered having more mathematical knowledge based on the fact that they, one, attended more mathematical PDs, and two, that they had more math content specific courses during their pre-service years, that those students did achieve at higher levels throughout the 2-year period. And so what was interesting is there were still students that achieved at higher levels, but they're not as high as those with the teachers that had those 2 to 6 content specific classes. They did make a point of talking about that most elementary education prep is not necessarily based on content specific courses, but more on math methods courses. And that these math methods courses, from the teacher perspective, actually helped the teacher become a better educator because she learned about representations or strategies. But those teachers who actually took the 2 to 6 content specific courses felt more knowledgeable, and that they had a higher self-esteem as far as mathematics teaching went, that they felt more comfortable teaching the mathematics. And so their discussion and their implications were that the more a teacher engages in mathematics content knowledge, the more likely he or she will be able to raise student achievement. And so one of the things that they did imply is that if we have teachers that aren't necessarily had that background where they were in those content specific classes, that educators PD needed to focus not so much on strategies and methods, but they needed to specifically focus on content specific knowledge in order to increase teachers' mathematical knowledge, thus giving them more understanding of the math, which in return they could teach conceptually and actually increase students' understanding of the mathematics. Another thing that they talked about was they found that it wasn't as 100% important that teachers had math knowledge, but those teachers who had been, and let me say this, math knowledge from college, those teachers who had been teaching for longer periods of time and who had attended PDs also felt like they had the knowledge needed, and that their scores actually align with those teachers who had that 2 to 6 math content courses in college, that they were actually just as knowledgeable as those teachers. And so they showed that sometimes through experience, after years of experience and PDs, that teachers could gain that same content specific knowledge, thus increasing student achievement. And so as I do more research, I will be looking at more of these studies in an attempt to link teachers' mathematical knowledge to student success. And so as I was digging, because I said, okay, so if it is content knowledge and effective teaching that helps increase student achievement, what exactly is what exact knowledge would necessarily be needed inside of the classroom? And so as I dug through that aspect of my research, I found a book, and it's titled Mathematical Proficiency for All Students Toward a Strategic Research and Development Program in Mathematics Education. And so there was one particular chapter that I focused on, and it was called Teachers' Mathematical Knowledge, Its Development and Use in Teaching. And it was written by a RAND Mathematics Study Panel. And so their big idea is content knowledge and increasing content knowledge to increase student success. And so it wasn't necessarily a study itself, but it was based on past studies, past educational research studies that were based on teacher knowledge and its connection to student success. And so some of the big focuses of this particular chapter in this particular book dealt with actual mathematics knowledge and the knowledge that is actually required to become an effective mathematics teacher. And so some of the things that they talked about were key resources that were actually needed to use your knowledge while teaching. And so I actually found, I would like to read more of this book actually, because it was the chapter that I did read actually helped me understand what researchers believe is needed for effective mathematics teaching. And then I thought about the book that we read in class, and I tried to make the connections between the two. And so after reviewing a lot of research, after reviewing a lot of the research, these authors found that across the United States, teachers actually had a weaker mathematics knowledge base. And that they, some of the things that they implied is that it was time to increase this knowledge, because without it, it is really hard to become an effective mathematics teacher. And so some of the things that they focused on was actually the knowledge itself that was needed to enable effective mathematics teaching across different schools. And so they conducted interviews, and they questioned teachers and about their teaching, and did some observations. And they also dug through old research to better understand what specifically would help teachers become better at mathematics and delivering mathematics content. And so many of the teachers that they did speak to actually understood the algorithms, and they understood the procedures of the mathematics, but when they were asked to explain why, or to deepen their explanations of the procedures, that was pretty much their stopping block. They lacked the knowledge needed to actually sit there and explain, or to produce a why of why do these procedures work? Why does this specific procedure work for this specific problem, and why won't it work for other problems like it? And so that some of their findings were actually saying that, okay, we have teachers, it's very obvious that they are weak in mathematics and their content knowledge. They understand the procedures itself, and so they can do the 2 plus 3 or the 1/2 plus 1/3. But when it comes down to really explaining and understanding conceptually, they lack in this knowledge. And because of this, they are unable to actually teach the mathematics conceptually. And so they found that they were teaching more procedures, and that their students weren't as effective in mathematics in comparison to those who actually taught conceptually. And so some of the things that they were pretty much in line with a lot of the other research that I've been reading. They were pretty much saying, one, we have to focus on content specific knowledge. And so teachers are going to have to take more mathematics content classes in comparison to what is actually going on in college preparatory programs. Two, they implied that it was time to reshape professional development opportunities, and that this didn't necessarily need a focus on specifically strategies and methods, but more on content specific knowledge for the specific grade levels. And so as I read more about this, it's actually very interesting to see how each of these researchers kind of align themselves with that same theme, that we're going to have to do something. If we want better mathematics, we're going to have to change things, both in pre-service and during service. So thanks for listening.